Transformation in Trials. Welcome to Transformation in Trials. This is a podcast exploring all things transformational in clinical trials. Nothing is off limits on the show, and we will have guests from the whole spectrum of the clinical trials community. And we're your hosts, Ivana and Sam. Welcome to another episode of Transformation in Trials. Today, we are very fortunate to have Maya Zlatanova in the studio with us, who is the CEO of Trialhub and FindMeCure. Hi, Maya.
Hi, Ivana. Hi, Sam. Nice to be with you.
So good to have you here. So today we're going to be zooming in on how to pivot your trial strategy during trial execution based on data. And just to set the stage for us, Maya, could you talk to how is clinical trial strategy usually defined and how often is it revisited in a clinical trial?
Yeah, thanks for this question, because something that we sometimes forget is how important it is to set the stage right. And in clinical trials, that's even more important. Actually, I would argue that more than 50% of the success in the term of the clinical trial, success in terms of timelines, in terms of patients, retention, recruitment, data quality, etc. Everything is basically predefined when you're building your strategies at the very, very beginning. So I wouldn't use the term feasibility, because many people see feasibility as the site selection, but planning of a clinical trial takes a lot more. Actually, it starts from the very, very beginning, deciding on, okay, we have this new target, this new idea, this new innovation. How do we validate that this is really providing the quality, the quantity, whatever we're trying to target, basically, to the population? And then how do you define the strategy is consuming a lot of information, and that's the biggest challenge, because again, something that we forget is that clinical trials are actually global animals. That's how I define them. They're really, truly global. Yes, you can start in one country, 2 countries maximum, but very easily you actually jump into more than 1, 2 countries. And that the more countries you add to your strategy, the more complicated it can get. Obviously, regulations are trying to unify standards, unify requirements, etc., but it's not just about regulatory here. It's about the patient's reality. It's about their standard of care. It's about the doctors, the investigators, their capacity, their culture, a lot of things, basically. And usually when I call them the clinical trial strategists, when they are to start thinking about the clinical trial, they're really challenged with providing answers to very complicated questions. The bad news is they're challenged to provide answers to simpler questions as well, just because you have to consume lots of information.
Yeah, that makes sense. And if we look at when we usually design the clinical trial strategy, I know that there are some common trial design parameters and models that are frequently used, and that these may not be accurate compared to what happens in the real world. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And first to say that I'm not that experienced with building a design of a clinical trial, but I have some experience, and I've been working with lots of colleagues and friends around the area. One thing that really struck me was when speaking, especially with medical writers, for example, the fact that we start from templates, but the thing is that some protocols, the moment you start building the design of a new clinical trial, protocol around an existing template, you kind of define later on the challenges that you're going to meet later on. And there is this dilemma. Do I start from scratch, but then maybe spend more time, but then think of the basics, the really, really, truly true basics? Or do I start somewhere where I already used to starting and just upgrade? And there is no answer to that. That's the complexity of clinical trials, that each and every clinical trial is very, very different on its own. So I think that you should really make this assessment. Are you doing something that's really different than what you've previously done? If you ask me, if there is a way to start from scratch, from the very basics, I would do that. Because even if you're doing a similar clinical trial, you can always innovate or always think of a challenge or a methodology that has slightly different perspective. So it's always best to start from the basics. The question is, do you have this time? Do you have this luxury, so to say? And what are the KPIs and the requirements by the management as well? Very often, the people who are designing the clinical trial protocol are not the people who are setting these KPIs, etc. And that kind of like defines what happens at the end of the day. Yes, it's good to work with templates. I agree that we need to find repeatable models, successful models, but it will be also good to every now and then challenge these models, challenge these templates, and see what works and what not. One good example, that's the last thing I'm going to say about design is now with the centralized clinical trials. How are we expecting to have a successful different type of a clinical trial if you're using the same template that we've used before? I don't think that's possible.
No, absolutely. And how could we do that differently? Is there a way to stay closer to reality and stay away from some of these models that may not work every time? How can we get closer to the real world?
I think that in order to be close to the real world, is if we are to consume information about the real world constantly, not only when we need the data, but constantly. I think that in order to design more successful clinical trials and plan clinical trials like more successfully, we need to follow like a certain, let's say, framework, certain templates. Something that we are doing, for example, in my company, when we first started, and even now, when we have these meetings to challenge some of the new ideas that we have, one of the main questions we're asking is, what can go wrong? I think we're not asking this question so often, and we should, because at the end of the day, in answering this question, what can go wrong, can actually define these challenges that are in front of us, and then they can help us see the clinical trial from a different perspective. So starting with the right questions is essential, but and here that's very important. But because we're so much into what we traditionally have been doing, like for example, the first question might not be what can go wrong, but instead, which sites should I choose? Which countries do I select, right? And that's very traditional, and I completely understand that this is a part of the process, but I'm just arguing that maybe that's not the beginning. And the beginning is, especially if we speak about real world understanding the reality, we need to then understand first what happens with the patient in reality, what happens with the investigators in reality. Because these are the two main, let's say, stakeholders without which there is no clinical trial. You can replace everything else, but without patients and the investigators, you can't do a clinical trial. So maybe first ask the question, what's the reality of the patients that I'm targeting? Or let's say the group of patients, because maybe you're still defining eligibility criteria, et cetera, et cetera. But let's say overall, what do these people experience? And then what do investigators experience when they're running clinical trials or when they're treating the patients? What are their challenges? And then what can go wrong when working with both these patients and these investigators in these countries, and so on and so forth. And then there will be the additional factors like the regulatory, the time frame, the timelines, competition, and so on and so forth.
And that makes sense. And what kind of data would be available to sponsors to understand the reality of both the investigators and the patients?
Not much, to be honest. But that's the trouble. That's the trouble. Usually, so I will speak only from my experience. I've been working with big and medium and small size clinical research organizations, say pharma, biotech, small biotech, medium biotech. So I've seen different stakeholders, let's say. And from my experience, especially when it comes to patients, that's coming much, much later in the process. It shouldn't, but that's the reality. Especially in this dynamic when the biotech company is outsourcing their everything to the clinical research organization. The clinical research organization thinks that the biotech has done their homework, understanding the patients and the overall market need, let's say. And then the biotech, they expect that the CRO is going to do this homework because they're the experts at the end of the day. And eventually, nobody does that. And then they end up answering a lot of questions around site, countries, regulations, everything around the traditional type of questions, but nothing near to the patients. I'm not answering your question now, so going back to data around patients' reality, and then I'll go back to the science. So when it comes to patients, I can't say there is much, but I can't say there is none at the same time. So good partners and maybe the first thing I would do is to go to and speak with patient communities and patient organizations. That's not always the case available. Some indications have more, other indications have none. Sometimes it's very hard if you're working. I'll give you one example, solid tumors. Solid tumors can be across a lot of different cancer types, right? So who do you go to? Who do you choose? But still, if you can engage with some patient organizations, that's a good idea, because just speaking to them and understanding how they see the landscape and what they've been trying to achieve. Not so much what do you think about my product and my idea versus what have you been fighting for? Which are these challenges that are still there, and you started fighting against them 10 years ago, for example. What are the things that are on top of your head, on top of the head of your audience, for example? Another good source of information would be these new tools, and I've been speaking about them for quite some time, social listening tools. They're already quite available, actually quite accessible. Social listening tools which allow you to understand what are the sort of things that communities and just people are speaking about around a certain disease or disease area, like therapeutic area, for example. That's not going to give you 100% of the picture, but it will give you some sort of a beginning, let's say. What usually, that's very interesting, what usually biotech companies do, and I'm generalizing, obviously. There are people and people, there are companies and companies, but I'm speaking about the majority of the cases. They actually, instead of going first and speaking with patient organizations or going and doing these social listening is maybe something that's very far away from them, they do reading of publications, because that's something that they it's within their habits, within their comfort zone, let's put it that way. So what they're trying to do is they call it the desk research, and this is actually helpful. It is helpful. They read publications that can help them kind of map out the patient journey. In these publications, they can read from other similar people, what they've experienced by working with such patients, what were the outcomes, and so on and so forth. So this is also helpful. So that's research I think most companies do. But I'm just thinking about these things that you can do beyond desk research, like the patient organizations, the social listening. I think there are a lot of companies as well that are trying to provide, not only companies, also organizations. And I'm not speaking about the traditional patient organizations, but organizations and NGOs who are around bringing this patient voice. On top of my head is UPATI, which is a great European initiative. It's an academy for patients. And actually, they train patient experts. Behind the patient experts, they are the the whole educational program, how to provide input, how to provide feedback, etc., etc. So, and they actually built mechanisms they have this matchmaking platform called UPATI Connect, and you can go there and request different questions and get insight.
Are all of these data sources that you're talking to at the moment, are these typically what people would look to pre-trial to help them establish their strategy before the trial starts? Or is some of what you're talking to also available during the course of the trial and may influence the strategy pivoting during the course of the trial? Just curious on that one.
Yeah. So traditionally, what companies are doing is going after doing the desk research, the publications, and then Some of them are also trying to build some capacity around patient organizations. Usually that they're doing that much later, in my opinion, but they're still doing that in one way or another. When it comes to the other things, it's very much case by case. But I think that we should be utilizing these other tools more often. When it comes to utilizing this during the clinical trial, if you have asked me a few months ago, I would say yes, definitely, because that can change the course of your trial. But in the last couple of months, I realized that changing the course of your trial is super, super, super hard. You could, but then it comes with an enormous cost, financial, time, resources, everything basically. So how possible it is, and that's like an open question really, how possible it is to change your protocol only because your patient, like the patient organization told you that your, let's say, not eligibility criteria, let's say your schedule is not really patient friendly. Would you do that? No, you're not going to do that. You're going to, because that will come, like having a protocol amendment costs you a lot of time and money. So you won't do that unless, and here is actually the point which is where most companies struggle, unless your recruitment rate, that you're really struggling with your recruitment rate. So then it's a huge pain. And then you might rethink what your patient organization told you. But I'm just saying that there are some other things that you can actually monitor and try to, they're more related to other things though, not so much on the patient journey, because the patient journey wouldn't change so much. Like, let's say if you started your trial 6 months ago, and now you're like running your clinical trial, the patient journey overall, like let's say not journey, but the overall needs and challenges may not be so different. But I'm excluding here changes that can happen with the standard of care. So yes, you can monitor, like you can speak with patient organizations even throughout the clinical trial. You can use social listening tools, but then doing changes afterwards, it's very hard.
Yeah, and you mentioned that often these changes happen if there is trouble recruiting the patients that we expected in the geographies we expected maybe. How would you navigate, or how would you understand that there's trouble recruiting in some specific geographies?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's a question I started asking at the beginning of this year, because I suddenly realized that at least in my company, we're helping clinical trial strategists exactly at the planning stage of the clinical trial. And the way we are helping them is by assessing the clinical trial landscape, the clinical research landscape, basically. And I'm like every now and then I will be also involved in a few projects, and I see that we're speaking about, the competition, the size capacities, the patient's journey, and all these important things about the clinical trial. And then I suddenly started thinking, okay, well, but we're now at like deciding on the clinical trial. What happens when you start your clinical trial a month from now, for example? You start, but these things, they still continue changing. Not everything, but like a lot of these things still continue changing, and they are determining whether your strategy will be successful or not. Things like, for example, new competitive trials, or let's say your really promising sites suddenly start working on a lot more clinical trials, and they're no longer so promising like before. Or we had actually such a case last year that actually triggered my way of thinking. The drug that was a comparator drug, or maybe it was a drug in the eligibility criteria. I don't remember details, but the drug that we had to assess for this clinical trial protocol suddenly became not reimbursed in Slovakia. They changed the reimbursement status. And that actually came with a really interesting conversation. What do you do next? In our case, because we're getting these real-time insights, we can actually gather this information immediately. Once the status was changed, we immediately could see that. But then I asked other colleagues, and not colleagues so much, but like other companies, biotech and clinical research organizations, how do you usually get these alerts or notifications? They actually don't. I mean, usually they're getting this information when they're communicating with the investigators. So there are two ways they get signals on how the clinical trial is, like what happened with the clinical trial, and if something changes. And the way is the first signal is the recruitment rate going slow, not as expected, for example. So that's the first signal. If you ask me, that shouldn't be the first signal, because if you're relying on that, you're already in trouble. You have to find signals that are much before the recruitment rate starts to slow down, because the moment it slows down, you're already late with your decision making, and you have to make urgent decisions, and like you're 100% delayed, basically. That's what it is. So what they do once they see the recruitment rate going slow, like slower than expected, then they go back to investigators usually, and they try to understand from them, did anything change? Like, did something happen in your side, or did something happen with patients? What do you think is the reason behind the slowdown? And then they start understanding what might be the reason for that. Expecting from the investigator. Sometimes investigators are proactive, and they come back to the CRO or the sponsor saying, hey, just so you know, I just heard that this drug is no longer reimbursed, for example, and are you going to cover this up, or whatever. But that's basically relying on the investigator being proactive and thinking about your clinical trial. And many investigators are working on multiple clinical trials at the same time. So I think the ultimate solution actually is having these real-time notifications, or at least have like a weekly or monthly reminders on your calendar. Have you checked the competition today? And have you checked like your site capacity? And have you checked like what's the dynamic around the drug that it's in the core of your strategy, and so on and so forth?
That makes sense. And also, I think it's interesting that we often rely on this specific metric, but in fact, it's a lagging indicator. It's something we see after the problem has already occurred, and you can catch it way earlier if you just have access to the right data and that you monitor the markets that you're in.
Exactly. As an entrepreneur, I would say that this is like the ultimate North Star. Like having the right recruitment rate is like kind of like that should be the goal. It's the metric, but it's the final result in the end. So if that's the result, then we should have other metrics that we're tracking proactively, not reacting, not like reacting on that, but proactively on measuring these metrics so that we can know upfront, okay, maybe in a few months, I should be expecting a slowdown. Or if I don't want to deal with the slowdown, I should do something about it. Adding more countries, adding more sites, adding more support to patients, or whatever is feasible. Maybe just to elaborate on what Sam asked me. So, Sam, you asked me, what can I do when it's during the clinical trial, using these tools that I mentioned about the patient, right? Well, exactly. If you have this like a metric before the recruitment rate, and you know that it's not competition, it's not the site's capacity, but it's, for example, the schedule of the clinical trial, then you should have built this capacity to engage with patient organizations, or you're already in contact with them. I would immediately go and actually ask for their help. The schedule with my problem, or let's say patients are not happy, not attracted to my clinical trial. Why do you think is the reason? What do you think is the reason for that? So that's a good point to go there at this stage.
Yeah, no, I'm curious to hear more about it, because I think I agree with you guys. The recruitment rate is a metric that everyone hones in on, because I also think that's something it's quite sort of binary, isn't it? It's very clear what you have or you haven't recruited X number of patients. For these other metrics you're talking about, Maya, because there's lots of information out there. How does the interpretation of that data take place to then create some more meaningful insights? Those types of data points might be less kind of binary than the recruitment metrics.
These are, I would call them like the recruitment rate is more or less the North Star metric.
Yeah,
I say that really shows you where you are in your process and how are you on track or not. But other metrics can be, obviously there are other things like first patient in, when the systems are being ready to go, data collection and so on and so forth. But I speak about kind of like signals related to the recruitment rate. Signals like, for example, you know that if you have a lot of competition, and here competition can be divided into two main competitions, two main types of competition. One is other clinical trials. And these other clinical trials can be also divided into two other groups, competition that are directly competing for the same patient profiles. That's one type of a competition. And then competition that's just other clinical trials, but are still taking away the attention of your investigator or the capacity of your site.
Got it.
So that's competition is one of the things that influences your recruitment rate. Another thing that influences your recruitment rate is it's again competition, but the competition here comes from standard of care. So when like the standard of care more or less defines if the patient will be attracted to your clinical trial, because for the patient, the clinical trial is nothing else but another alternative of their treatment pathway, right? Sometimes it's attractive. In other cases, it's completely not. And what defines this is basically what's my access to other treatments, to other procedures, obviously what's required by me. But you literally, when you're a patient, you kind of like try to compare the both options. You try to make to get the biggest benefit with the minimum risk, right? So that's the way we should be thinking about clinical trial. Clinical trial compared to the standard of care in this country, what are the risks and what are the benefits on both sides? And to be honest, that should be the way we also present informed consent. It's almost like in the business, when you try to sell something, you're trying to really provide the business case. What are you going to get out of my product, out of my services, right? It's the same with the patients. We need to try to help them understand what are the benefits and what are the risks, but compared to the standard of care, sometimes that's not easy to assess because the patient wouldn't know 100% what are the procedures and what's required by the standard of care. And sometimes you see the informed consent and you know that there are 10 visits and then there is colonoscopy, for example. And that sounds horrifying, right? But you don't know that maybe if you're going after like the standard of care, you still have the same procedure down the road. And you maybe have not 10 visits, but you have 5 visits. But here maybe you have better care. For example, I'm going to give you one example. So the standard of care is also competition, but competition not for the patient, with the patient, so to say. So this is also something that you need to follow because standard of care changes not every now and then, but sometimes suddenly a new drug is being approved. Boom, like this is more promising, for example, especially in countries where they reimburse almost everything, like Germany, Switzerland. States is a slightly different thing. Like states is a different universe. But again, clinical trials are global. So we can't just think with our US mindset, well, in the US, we don't have this reimbursement. Yes, you don't. But the moment you step out of the States, like of the USA, then everything's so much different. Another thing you asked me, so competition, standard of care. I was speaking to a friend of mine today, and she told me about a case where they had in the country, they had to change not the regulations, but some procedures because they had an earthquake. So imagine there is like a natural disaster, and suddenly all of the plants that you had up front, they are no longer active, or at least for a certain period of time. And what about the war in Ukraine? Same thing. You didn't expect that they will have a war, or maybe you thought this might happen, but you didn't know when, for example. But you started your clinical trial in Ukraine. So being able to get instant, like real-time updates on what happens in the different countries and focus on the main thing that can influence your recruitment rate, like how attractive your clinical trial is to patients and what can influence the capacity and attention and efforts by the site. I think that these are the main things.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Maya, I'm curious, how did you arrive in this space? And maybe you could also tell us a little bit more about what Trialhub does.
So I'm smiling because that's a very long and very funny story, but I'll give you the short story, not so funny story. Basically, I started working in clinical research maybe more than 15 years ago now. But I was more on the regulatory side and actually software development as well. I was working for a company where we built the entire infrastructure of the NIHR. like the National Institute of Health Research in the UK. And so that's where I was introduced to clinical research first. And then since then, I'm working always in clinical research. But planning of a clinical trial actually started around end of 2018. And 2018, that's when I was already deep working on FindMeCure. And we first started with the platform for patients that allows people, caregivers, patients to volunteer for clinical trials. We were actually invited to work on some global projects to bring awareness among a specific type of patients. And that's actually when I started realizing that a lot of the clinical trials are not planned to recruit patients. I mean, the purpose is to recruit patients, but they're not planned. Like they're not really positioned to recruit patients. And that's when I started asking these first questions. How do we plan clinical trials? Like, what do we take into consideration? And it's been a learning journey. It's a learning curve, really. Since 2018 till now, I've been working with a lot of feasibility, clinical operations experts, medical affairs, medical writers, all sorts of people involved in the clinical strategizing process, feasibility, both CROs and sponsors with Trialhub. Or Trialhub actually is a decision-making platform that allows clinical trial strategists to get accurate insights on the clinical research landscape, all indications worldwide. So actually, we've built this platform exactly to support these clinical trial strategists with these insights. So since 2019, we've supported more than close to 3,000 clinical trials so far. And actually, that gave me this kind of like observation on what usually happens, where we have the gaps, where we struggle. And don't get me wrong, I don't think that we've built, or not only we, I speak the whole industry. The way where we are today is definitely not ultimate and 100% bulletproof, but we are improving. And the good news is that we have better ideas of which are these really big gaps, like the one that I mentioned, the patient understanding. I think that's a huge gap that we need to be fighting to overcome, because I think that will really improve tremendously our results in the clinical trial sector.
And that's the perfect segue to the last question that we always ask all of our guests. And that is, if you had a magic wand that you could wave and change one thing in our industry, what would that be?
Oh, that's very, very dangerous. One. Actually, I have the answer. But the thing that the answer is like almost not possible. But you said we're not thinking about what's possible. Yes, magic. If every single doctor was an investigator, that's exactly what I'm going to do. Every single doctor should be an investigator. By law, by whatever, I don't care. But every single doctor should be an investigator. That will change everything in clinical research.
That's my favorite wish so far, actually. I agree. It's short, simple, but very effective. Thanks for sharing that.
That will transform everything, but ultimately, clinical research should become a part of healthcare, and it is a part of healthcare. Healthcare exists because of clinical research, and the other way around. So yes, if one day we have all doctors also involved, all of them in research one way or another, I think a lot of our challenges now will be solved.
Amazing. Maya, this has been a great episode, and I'm sure many of our listeners are going to want to get in touch with you and learn more, both about yourself, but also about Trialhub. Where's the best place for listeners to come and connect with you?
You can find me on LinkedIn. Always happy to connect with new, interesting people. It's people also that have a different perspective. Guys, we're here to have a discussion and hear different perspectives. So be open, be transparent. And if you disagree with anything that I said, please let me know, because I might change my mind at the end of the day, right? LinkedIn and also our website. You can Google Trialhub as well if you want to have a look. And if you want to learn about our crazy ideas, I would encourage you to contact us, because we are with this mindset, the sky is the limit. And we really want to bring something that's valuable to the industry. So anyone that has their opinion or that want to share their talent, it's more than welcome.
Brilliant. Maya, that was excellent. Thanks for your time, and we look forward to catching up with you soon.
Thank you as well. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Ivana.
You're listening to Transformation in Trials. If you have a suggestion for a guest for our show, reach out to Sam Parnell or Ivana Rosendal on LinkedIn. You can find more episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or in any other player. Remember to subscribe and get the episodes hot off the editor.